Hello and welcome back once again to this short video series based around financial planning when moving to France. So before we get down to the nitty-gritty of this subject, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Tracy Leonetti. I'm a relocation expert based in the south of France for the past 30 years. And when I came to France 30 years ago, I personally struggled to get through all the different paperwork processes, visas, healthcare, driving license, and so much more. It was really difficult. And I realized it shouldn't be that difficult. So that is why I created in 2012 LBS. Really, it was to help you, people like yourself, really, who want to move, live, or create a business in France. And then in 2016, I created the Serenity Club, which is basically a bespoke relocation service for the first year in France to help you through all of the paperwork processes. Um, I realized that, when you move into France and you're thinking of moving to France, obviously the first thoughts goes around buying properties, immigrations, but we really need to think about the paperwork side and also plan for the financial situations for your future life in France. I have found that my clients ask very important questions in our meetings and consultations. And some of the times it's interesting, and Simon maybe give his information on this later on, but they find information on social media platforms, which is often interesting, but not always true, or there is not one situation meets everybody's situation. So it's really important to get the right answers to the right question. And that is why I started with this small video series, really to get clarity on some of those important questions. So in the last video, we focused our discussion around investment planning, and we looked at how we could help a typical family who are moving to France with their tax efficiency. We looked at ISAs, and we looked also at Assurance V and how they can be used to protect your family. And if you missed the video, then do go back and watch the replay, or of course, reach out to myself so I can get that video to you. In this fourth video, we are going to take a look at pensions and how they work in France. It's a really big subject. Certainly for me, during initial consultation with my clients, I do try and explain how the tax situation works in France. But of course, I get lots of questions around pensions and pension planning. And there is such a lot of confusion about the different types of pensions and how they are taxed in France. So I really wanted to get some clarity on some of these questions. And of course, to help me with these questions, I have the pleasure and honor of introducing to you today to Simon Eveleigh. He's a partner at Blevins, France. He's based out of Aix-en-Provence. And Simon, maybe you could introduce yourself to everybody listening today.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, hello to everyone. As Tracy said, my name's Simon Eveleigh. I've been working for Blevins France now for 15 years, living in France. Blevins France is a wealth management company, and our main reason for being is to help people as they transition out of the UK into France. We are also present in other markets in Europe, but obviously we're concentrating here on the French market. It's all about making sure that you do the right things at the right time as you leave the UK and as you enter France, so that you can make maximum use of any opportunities there are for planning, both as a UK resident before you leave the UK system and as a French resident as you enter the French system. And we'll talk a little bit more now today about the pension side of things. But as Tracy's already mentioned, we've done a few other videos on other aspects of financial planning. And the aim is that if you tie all the bits together, hopefully you get everything right.
Perfect. Thank you, Simon, for that. Exactly. So if you haven't seen the other videos, as Simon said, it's good to go and take a look at those. So let me remind you, if you're first time today, of the family that we have really put our advice around. It's a family, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, a married couple. It's a second marriage. They have a child to their previous marriages, and they have a child together as well. We also have Grandad Smith, of course, who's moving with them, and they have a will in the UK. We talked about inheritance and wills in one of the previous videos, so do take a look at that. Today, obviously, we're a lot focused around Grandad Smith, who obviously He's in his 60s. He has private pensions, state pensions, and he's moving to France with his family. So we will really be focusing more around the Grandad Smith today. So, Simon, as I said just previously, lots of questions. I get so many questions from my clients in conversations about pension pots in the UK. So maybe it might be good if you could start off by give us an overview of the different types of pensions that, you know, like Grandad Smith, he has private pensions, state pensions, NHS pensions, and kind of how they are dealt with from a tax perspective in France.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are three broad categories, as you said, there are three broad categories of pension. The state pension, pensions that come from government service, so a military service pension or a civil service pension, and then what we might term private pensions, either from the workplace or pensions that you built up just through your own savings through your working lifetime, personal pensions, SIPs, those sorts of things. The simple thing to say is that the double tax treaty between the UK and France will always tell us what gets taxed where and will help to ensure that you're never taxed twice on the same income. Pensions from government service, civil service pensions, will always remain taxable in the UK. You're meant to show, or you have to show those on a French tax return, but you will not be directly taxed in France on that income because it's already been taxed in the UK. You'll actually get a credit in France for the French tax that would have been payable had it been taxed in France, which is a very long-winded way of saying that pension is not taxed here in France. However, where people often get confused is that when we talk about government pensions, people will often say, oh, well, the UK state pension, that's a government pension. Yes and no. Under the terms of the double tax treaty, the UK state pension does not qualify as a civil service pension, and it is a pension that is taxable here in France. You will get it paid gross in the UK, but you will have to show that income on your French tax return, and you will pay tax on it here. And the same goes also for any private pension arrangements you may have. Anything that doesn't fit into the civil service pension category will be taxable here in France. And what you should also be able to do as you exit the UK is ensure that no further UK tax is taken at source on any pensions you may already have in payment, so that you get a gross amount in the UK, you declare that gross amount to the French taxman, and then you pay your tax on it here in France.
I think it's really important to mention here, so I think it's happening a lot, is this confusion, like you said, state pension, government pensions, and how to recognise what is a state pension, a government pension. Do you have any tips on how they can recognise if it's considered a civil service pension or not, Simon?
Well, I mean, the clue is obviously in the name. Anything that relates to working for the government would normally be counted as a civil service pension. There is a link on the website. I don't have the link in front of me, but there is a link on a website via HMRC to find out whether something qualifies as a civil service pension or not. There are one or two anomalies in the system in that certain NHS pensions are civil service pensions under the terms of the double tax treaty. Others aren't. You need to know, who's paying the pension and whether it qualifies as a civil service pension. As I said, there is a website, or there's a link on the HMRC site where you can find that information. Otherwise, your accountant in France or in the UK should be able to guide you with that as well.
And certainly from my point of view, I see this happening. We've just come through tax time right now, and obviously I deal with a lot of tax files for my clients, and this state pension and government pension situation from a tax perspective is important. It is on the onus of the client. So if you move into France, it's up to you to declare to the HMRC in the UK that you're moving to France, and it's up to you to do a tax declaration in France. They won't come and look for you to start with, so you have to certainly reach out to the tax authorities. And in the scenario where you haven't let the HMRC know in the UK that you moved to France, or your private pension people know that you moved to France, then the chances are you'll be paying tax on maybe your private pensions in the UK, but then you'll still have to declare that on your French tax declaration for tax in France, because the double tax treaty is not there to stop you paying tax on everything. It's only for really pensions that are obligatory paid in the UK. So I think that's important for people to realise. It's not a pick and choose situation. Does that make sense to you, Simon? Yeah?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, and there is a common misconception that if a pension is being taxed in the UK, that's good enough. But if a private pension is being taxed in the UK, because it would normally when you're a UK resident, the fact that you don't notify anyone and it continues to be taxed in the UK does not get you off the hook. You should have notified HMRC, then they will be able to notify the pension payer that they should no longer be deducting UK tax, and you then declare that to the French tax authorities. If, however, through your own ignorance or whatever, you have not notified HMRC and UK tax is still being deducted, you still have to tell the French about it, and it's up to you then to go back to HMRC and trying to get your money back from them. So what I would suggest is that the earlier you start the whole paper trail and stop the UK taking tax they don't need it or aren't entitled to anymore, the better for you.
Yeah, perfect. And that's what I say to my clients who haven't yet moved to France. So one of the first things I say is reach out to HMRC, reach out to your private pension funds and let them know you're moving to France from this date. Okay, so that's great. Let's move on with another question relating to Grandad Smith. So as we see here, he's in his late 60s. He hasn't yet drawn down on his pensions. What should he be doing before he leaves the UK? But I guess also, what should he not be touching until he gets to France?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing that we would suggest to people who are looking to move to France and have pensions they haven't yet touched is that you should really seriously consider taking your tax-free lump sum in the UK before you leave, because 25% of the pension fund is available in the UK as a lump sum free of any tax. There's no such thing as a tax-free lump sum in France. There is, and I'll talk in a minute about a special rate that applies to lump sum withdrawals from pensions, but there's none of it will be tax-free. So the fact that you can get your hands on 25% of your pension without paying tax to anyone is, for most people, very, very interesting. So and therefore very attractive. So therefore, we would usually suggest that you do something about taking your lump sum before you exit the UK. You can then look at ways of reinvesting that money if you don't actually have plans to spend it. And then on the reverse, as I said a minute ago, there is a special tax rate on lump sum withdrawals in France, which is 7.5%. In actual fact, it's slightly more complicated than that, because it's 7.5% on 90% of the value, which equates to a 6.75% tax rate. And in addition to that, there are social charges at a rate of 9.1%. So that equates to a total tax bill of just under 16%. But that applies to the whole pension fund. In the UK, if you withdrew the whole of your pension fund, you get 25% tax-free and 75% would be taxed as income. In France, if you draw the whole pension fund, the whole lot gets taxed at this rate of, as I just said, of just under 16%. And it could be even better, because if you are a UK state pensioner and you're coming to live in France, you will be able to obtain what they call an S1 form. And an S1 effectively means that the UK will be paying for your healthcare in France. And as a result of that, because you aren't a burden on the French state, you don't have to pay social charges on your pension income. And therefore, if that is the case for you, you're a UK state pensioner with an S1, anything you draw down as a lump sum from a pension whilst you're in France will only get taxed at the 6.75% rate I've talked about. So if you can play the game by taking 25% whilst you're still in the UK, and then taking the remainder once you've moved to France, and the whole tax bill will be very, very manageable.
That's excellent. That's a really good tip, actually. That's a really good idea. And it's interesting you mentioned the S1 there. I think that's a really important subject, and I get lots of questions on the S1 and how that works for social charges, but also for healthcare as well. So maybe we'll just spend a couple of minutes on that as well. The S1, as you've so rightly said, is very advantageous. For moving to France, if you have your state pension of state and of pension age, that S1 is going to be really useful, because if you're applying for a visitor's visa to come to live in France permanently, if you have proof that you can have an S1, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the S1 document, but you have an email saying that you're going to be getting the S1, then you don't have to take out private healthcare for the first year. And that could be for you and for your wife or husband as well. So that can save you quite a few thousand of euros in private healthcare for your first year. And on top of that, it facilitates the access to the French healthcare system, because unlike those coming to France without an S1, you have to wait 3 months before you can apply. Those who have an S1 can apply straight away to the healthcare system, because effectively the UK is responsible for the healthcare payments. Although you're exactly the same way as a French person. So that S1 form is not also good for the social contributions reductions that you're going to get, but it's also good to stop you having private healthcare cover for your visas. So yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just sorry to interrupt. I was going to pick up and say the other good news for people is that post Brexit, the S1 was part of the withdrawal agreement, and even if you are not yet of state pension age when you come to France, you will be entitled to an S1 when you get to state pension age in the UK and you start to draw your UK state pension.
Absolutely, yes. And that is a really important, because people tend to think that because of Brexit, they can't get the S1, but you can, even if you come to France, like Mr. Smith here, Grandad Smith, he's 61 in our example. Obviously, he doesn't have access to state pension yet, so he won't have the S1. But once he comes to France and he's then of state pension age and gets his state pension, he can apply to the S1 in the UK. And then on his tax declarations, of course, that will be advantageous, because you tick a box saying you have your S1 form, and then you don't pay the social charges on the healthcare side of things. So yeah, thanks for mentioning, Sam. It's very important. I think also might be a good idea just to explain a little bit how that tax system works as well, just very briefly. If we can say, from the UK, we know we work on a self-assessment. I know in France, and it's something we look at, is you work on a household. How can that work for a family like Mr. and Mrs. Smith or Grandad Smith, as they work on a household tax? How does that work?
Yeah, the French is, well, as you said, the household or the foyer system, whereby each individual in the household is what they call a part. Now, in this scenario, Grandad Smith would be separate to his, presumably his son and his daughter-in-law, because he might live in the same house, he wouldn't form part of their household because he's not a dependent. So if we look at Mr. and Mrs. Smith in the first instance, with 3 children, Mr. and Mrs. Smith themselves will count as one part, and then their children, they will get additional parts in the system for their children. So they will be able to divide their income by the number of parts that there are. So for people with 3 children, I think that they will get an extra 2 parts. So therefore, they will have 4 parts in the system, which means that they lump all of their income together, divide it by 4, and get 4 goes at each and every tax band. So it's highly beneficial. Now, many people will tell me that it costs you an arm and a leg to have children, and therefore the tax savings may not be worth it. But there is a benefit in the French tax system to having kids. For Grandad Smith, slightly different. Obviously, he looks like he's by himself, and therefore he will just be taxed as an individual. But if it's a married couple in retirement, and it can often be the case that one or other of them has a bigger pension, and therefore in the UK system you could find that one of them's paying higher rate tax, whereas the other one has very low level of income. In France, the system works in that the husband and the wife lump their income together, and therefore, as I said earlier, you get 2 goes at each and every tax band, and you could find that the tax bill, the income tax bill in France, is significantly lower than it would have been in the UK.
Yeah, excellent. That's really good. Yeah. And it's true, they do say in France that the bigger family you have, the less tax you pay. But yes, I'm not convinced it's the best argument to have 4 children. Okay, so I think we've covered that subject pretty well. I just wanted to finish off with one question that comes up quite often about the crops. I've had that use, and that can be quite helpful. Can you explain what that means to the people listening today?
Yeah, well, QROPS, Qualifying Regulated Overseas Pension Schemes. Basically, the qualifying regulated bit, that's governed by HMRC. What HMRC do not want people to do when they take their pensions outside of the UK is use that as a way of circumventing all UK pension rules. So the UK tax offices have to authorise any payment overseas, and to do so, they actually will look at an overseas pension scheme and give it a stamp. Does it qualify? Is it regulated? That's what the Q and the R bit are of QROPS. Okay. As I said, the rest of it, overseas pension scheme. So whilst you can't necessarily do anything you want once you've got the money out of the UK, there is still an advantage to transferring overseas, because once you've transferred overseas, you are no longer subject to future changes in UK pension legislation. At the moment, for example, the current government in the UK has recently announced they have got rid of the lifetime allowance, which was a cap on the amount that you could save into pension. And if you were above that lifetime allowance, you would pay an excess tax charge on the excess above the lifetime allowance. Without going into great technical detail, it was causing a bit of an issue within the NHS, because senior consultants were saying, well, it's no point me continuing to work because I will pay extra tax on my pension because it will take me above this lifetime allowance, and therefore I'm going to retire early. And it caused a problem within the NHS. To correct that problem, the current government decided that the lifetime allowance would be scrapped. Now, we know that the Labour Party has said if they get into power, one of the first things they would do is to put that back in place. There is a window of opportunity for people at this point in time to potentially move money out of the UK without any lifetime allowance charge, because the lifetime allowance currently doesn't exist. And then, if the lifetime allowance is brought back in at a later date by a change of government in the UK, it doesn't matter to you because you've moved your money out of the UK. So that's the real advantage. I mean, that's one scenario. But the basic advantage is once you've got your money outside of the UK, you're not subject to any future changes in UK pension legislation.
That's actually really quite a big tip, actually. So people watching this now really should be reaching out for this, because if there's that little gap there that they can actually link into now before anything changes for future government, that's a really good idea.
Absolutely,
yeah. Okay. I think we've kind of covered the subjects we wanted to in the questions. I don't want us to go and spend too much time on it because it is quite complicated. So what I would like to say that if, oh, hang on a sec, well, no, it's disappeared. What I would like to do is say that if you have any questions or anything that Simon has been saying today, or that I've been saying that has awakened a few more questions, and it's quite likely that it may. These videos here are here to touch on the subjects and try and get answers to you, but of course nobody's situation is the same. So if you are worried or you have questions, do reach out to Simon either directly or reach out to me and I'll put you in contact. But I hope at least what we've got so far has helped you. In our next video, on our 5th and final video, we'll be coming up very shortly, and it's about property. Now, It's not about property and the buying process. Of course, that I cover in my side of the business. This is really about property, capital gains, and how you'll pay tax on the property side of things in France. So if you have any interest in that, make sure you watch the next video. Simon, is there anything you want to add before I say goodbye today?
Just very briefly, Tracy, I mean, you touched on it yourself that this is quite a technical, highly technical area, you know, the pension aspect of things, and each individual circumstance will be different. And some of the things I've said it's sensible planning to do this or that. It will depend on your personal circumstances, whether what I think is sensible planning as a general rule necessarily fits for you. So you're right, Tracy, people do need to talk to people who understand the situation before they leap into something that may cause them problems in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said at the beginning, most of the questions and answers and things people go on the social media about visas and immigration, it happens all the time. But not everything is the same for everybody. So do reach out. And I just leaves me to say thank you again, once again, Simon, for being with me today. I will see you on the next video. Thank you, everybody, for following. And we see you on the next video on property.